Well, Treasurer Jim Chalmers handed down his mid-year update today, announcing that the deficit for this financial year has been reduced from $13.9 billion to just $1.1 billion. He said a second surplus was within striking distance.
We are not yet forecasting a second surplus, but we are within striking distance. We have given ourselves a chance, but we aren't there yet, and we've been deliberately cautious and deliberately conservative.
So why is the government in such a good budget position? Well, the Australian Financial Review reports that there's been tax revenue surge of almost $65 billion since May. And along with a delay in infrastructure spending, this has boosted the budget bottom line by $39.6 billion over the 4-year forward estimates. Political editor in the Fin Review, Phil Curry, reports that given the speed at which tax revenues pouring in, it's likely this financial year will record a surplus. He writes that the tax receipt uplift is due predominantly to personal income taxes being $30 billion higher than forecast, including $9 billion for this financial year, and company tax receipts being $34.5 billion higher over the next 4 years, and $9.2 billion higher for this financial year. Well, let's bring in now to discuss this Sky News host, Steve Price. Steve, look, the government boasting about these figures, good on them that it looks like there's going to be a surplus. Spending could have been higher. There are criticisms today, however, that not enough was done to cut spending. And as Phil Curry wrote in the Fin Review, there's $30 billion higher personal income taxes than was forecast. So this potential surplus looks like it'll come at the expense of failing to tackle bracket creep and higher taxes for Australians.
Yeah, I don't think too many Australians watching Sky tonight, looking at Jim Chalmers smiling through that media conference today, would be all that happy about that. I mean, this obsession with surpluses is something that Labor desperately wants, because they can then go to the next election and say, look, the opposition says we can't manage money. Look at us, we've had 2 surpluses. They couldn't have one during their last term of government. So it's all about the politics. And when you talk about those numbers, those figures, I mean, who's doing those estimates in Treasury? How do you get it that wrong? I mean, it's quite ridiculous that the figures could be that out of whack. And, you know, we've prosecuted this argument. Paul Murray's done it a lot. There was nothing there today in my EFO to give any relief to cost of living. The people tonight are struggling home. They're stopping at a petrol station. Petrol's still pretty high. It's come down a little bit. You know, the excise could easily be put away for 6 months. But what Jim Chalmers did today, Sharri, I think is he said, look, we've made a lot of money. We're going to stick it away. Maybe we'll give you some next year, but you go to Christmas and that's your bad luck.
Look, let's have a look at Queensland now. An exclusive in The Australian today reveals that Steve Miles was installed as Queensland's next Labor Premier because of a secret industrial deal done between 2 unions over government-funded infrastructure projects. The report says that both the United Workers Union and the Australian Workers Union were involved in king-making decisions, according to sources briefed on the negotiations. Miles today denied having any role in Anastasia Palaszczuk's resignation. He held a press conference. He was quite fiery when he was asked about the role of the unions. He said that unions are simply the bodies representing tens of thousands of workers. Steve, what do you think about these reports in The Australian about the way he came to power?
I love the way Jonathan Lee stuck it to him today too. He was very uncomfortable. I don't think Stephen Miles is going to handle the media particularly well, particularly when they're a bit aggressive. He's clearly done a deal with the unions and he's been caught out, and now the details have emerged of exactly what that'll do. And it's modelled on what Daniel Andrews did with the Victorian government, where he would do deals with the unions, and all of these big infrastructure projects that you see in Victoria and in Queensland now, they're going to be manned by union workers who are going to get really well paid. And so the unions are looking after their union members and they're using governments to help them do it. I don't think it's a great start for Stephen Miles. I think Queenslanders who were sick of Anastasia Palaszczuk are going to wake up pretty quickly to this bloke.
Now, another big story today, Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price has accused Albanese of ignoring Indigenous issues ever since his Voice to Parliament referendum failed. She said that we haven't heard from him since the failing of the Voice on any issues regarding Indigenous Australians, our most marginalised. She says it's disappointing that the Prime Minister appears to have abandoned this issue altogether. Steve, what do you think about this? She does seem to have a point.
I think she's the most honest politician in the country at the moment. She says what she believes. She's not afraid to speak out, and she makes a lot of sense. We know that Anthony Albanese, he did one whistle-stop tour to Alice Springs at the height of all the trouble they were having in the streets. Now, if any Australians watching us tonight don't believe that trouble still goes on in Alice Springs, you're kidding yourselves. And so Jacinta is putting on the record again that nothing's happened. And it's not just Anthony Albanese. Sharri, when was the last time we heard from any of the vocal Indigenous leaders who are out every day during the Voice campaign about anything? We haven't heard anything from a peep from them either. So suddenly you lose the yes vote, and you're pretending that all these problems for Indigenous communities, and look at what's going on in Townsville as an example, you're just pretending they've all gone away. I mean, it's pretty pathetic, and the Prime Minister needs, the next time he has a media conference, to be asked about her comments today.
Look, just finally, Steve, what do you think about this prospect that a lot of the political commentators are writing about, that the Prime Minister might be a one-term government, that if they win next time, there could be a minority government, but even that they say it's looking like he could just be a one-term government? There have been so many scandals in the second half of this year.
Yeah, I think Paul Kelly summed that up pretty well in The Australian today, where he said there's a lot of these marginal electorates that are getting very cranky. Now, the last thing we want to do is go back to minority government. I mean, I can still remember how horrible it was in 2010 when Julia Gillard tied with the coalition on 72 seats each. And you remember those days? You might have even been down in Canberra, where you had all those negotiations with Rob Oakeshott and with Tony Windsor and with Bob Katter to try and form some sort of cobbled together government. Can you imagine that happening again after the election we'll probably have in 2025 with the Teals and the government and the Greens? You imagine what sort of Australia we're going to end up with if that happens?
Well, exactly. And Steve, I mean, the Greens were a radical left group back then, 10 years ago, but now they're an anti-Semitic party, undoubtedly. They are an extremist party. You can't possibly form any sort of sensible government with the Greens.
No, you can't, and they'd have to. That's the only way that they could get the numbers if you go into minority government. So, look, in a sense, you'd rather that Labor won in its own right than have to go back to that sort of horse trading. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But if Peter Dutton keeps his nerve, you never know. Anthony Albanese might be a one-term Prime Minister.
All right, Steve Price, thank you so much for your time.